The young man had been caught twice now from stealing from the royal palace, and he was sentenced to execution. His mother came before Napoleon, pleading that he would be pardoned. And Napoleon told the woman, "He has stolen from me twice now, and he deserves justice, and that justice is death." To which the mother replied, "Your Highness, I'm not asking for justice, I'm asking for mercy." Napoleon replied, "He doesn't deserve mercy." To which the mother replied, "If he deserved it, then it wouldn't be mercy." Napoleon was so moved by this mother's love for her son that he did pardon him in that moment. Our word for tonight, as we continue our series on the one-word study, is mercy. And mercy, I don't know about for you, but mercy to me seems like something that is resigned to kings like Napoleon, people in positions of authority, where they're called to make judgment calls upon certain people and whether or not they should give them justice or give them mercy. And so it kind of throws us off maybe a little bit and on the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is talking about the type of character he wants his people to have, and he says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy." And so Jesus teaches us and informs us that mercy isn't something that is confined to the upper courts or confined to dignitaries, but mercy is a practice that is expected of God's people in our everyday life. But the question is, what does that look like? How is that applied? How do we see that within our daily life? Well, interestingly enough, in Hosea chapter 6, in verse 6, whenever God, through the prophet Hosea, is condemning the Israelite nation, he's condemning them for their immorality, for their ungodly living, for how they take advantage of the poor, how they are idolatrous and things of that nature. And he tells them in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." I desire mercy, or your translation might say, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. Now that phrase might sound familiar to you. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And it should. Because Jesus uses it in a variety of different ways in his ministry to address the religious elite of his day. And in fact, in two different instances, we see him using this phrase to call the Jewish people back to a greater understanding of what God desired for them as his people. The same thing Hosea is doing in Hosea chapter 6. But the difficulty is that it's a little bit confusing to understand what exactly Hosea is talking about and what Jesus is meaning. So what does that mean to have mercy and not sacrifice? Let's turn over to one of those instances in the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. In Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. He said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus is going out. He calls Matthew a tax collector who by far was probably not the most popular of the apostles amongst the others who were Jewish men. Maybe Matthew had even taken some taxes from them. But this opens a door of opportunity for Jesus to go in and to eat and dine with sinners. And when the religious elite, when the Pharisees see this, they think and they ask, what is he doing? Why is this supposedly righteous man eating and dining with these unrighteous people? And this was a serious problem. Because dining with someone meant that you were in fellowship with them. It meant that you were friends, comrades. And so it's not just about Jesus having a meal, it's about Jesus giving worth to the individuals that are at the table. He is showing simply by having a meal with them that they matter. They matter. And the Pharisees have a problem with this. And when Jesus understands their issue, he says, I want you to go and learn what this means. Notice that he calls for them, this was a common rabbinic phrase within Jesus' day and time. I want you to go and learn. I want you to go, leave, and meditate and think on what I'm trying to tell you here. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now again, when we're looking at that, I think the same applies to us to go and learn what it means, because initially I'm thinking, what does he mean here? How does that phrase apply to this particular situation? I think we might get a little bit fuller understanding of it when we see the other instance in which Jesus uses this phrase. Turn just a few chapters over to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who are with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So here Jesus' disciples are hungry, they're walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and they're grabbing these grains and they're eating them. That's a problem for the Pharisees, because the law on the Sabbath is you're not supposed to do any work. And you're not supposed to be doing any physical type of effort. And so they're looking at Jesus and his followers saying, they're violating the Sabbath. That is a serious offense for the Jews. In fact, it's an offense that's worthy of death. And so this isn't some minor thing that they're accusing the disciples of. And Jesus says, he uses a couple of different examples to get a point across. But one of the examples he uses is David, who in a particular instance when he was hungry with the soldiers, went in and ate the bread of the presence, the holy bread, which was unlawful for him to eat. And he uses that as an example to show that the apostles were justified in eating this grain, even though the Sabbath might have condemned what they were doing. And then he uses this phrase, if you knew what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned. Now here's an important point, the guiltless. They're saying they're guilty. Jesus is saying they're guiltless. And he says the reason that they fail to understand the difference between those two categories of people is because they don't understand mercy. Again, what is Jesus meaning here? Let's turn to just one more place. Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23. Starting at verse 23, Jesus is kind of issuing his final rebuke of the Pharisees before they crucify him. He says in verse 23, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, and you swallow a camel. Here we're getting to the heart of Jesus' issue with the Pharisees and their misunderstanding of the heart of God. Their issue was not that they did religious practice wrong. That wasn't the problem of the Pharisees. They had all of the right, proper religious practices. In fact, even at one point, Jesus said, they sit in Moses' seat. You need to listen to what they say. That wasn't their issue. They had all of the external forms down. They had the right sacrifices. They tithed correctly. And so if you look from the outside looking in, they were the perfect religious people. And everyone, when they would walk down the street, they would say, look, there's a Pharisee. That person loves the Lord. Look, we see him praying on the corners all the time. They give alms to the poor. And Jesus says, you're whitewashed tombs. Because you don't understand the heart of God. Here's the issue that Jesus was trying to get to. The Pharisees were so concerned with meticulous rule keeping that they miss the mercy of God. They miss the mercy of God. Now, Jesus is not saying here that obeying God is not important. Jesus is not saying that following His word is not important. He tells them in Matthew chapter 23 that they should have kept doing those things, the tithing, without leaving the other things undone. But He says, you're straining out a gnat and you're swallowing a camel. You've got these minor things right, but you've got the major parts of the gospel absolutely wrong. And it's shown in the two examples that we saw in Matthew 9 and Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 9, the Pharisees are so concerned about making sure that other people don't think that they're condoning the sins of others, that it keeps them from going and reaching out to the very people that they should be ministering to. They're so concerned with maintaining their appearance of righteousness that they fail to do the very thing that the sacrifices that they were so concerned about were meant for, which was to show mercy. And Jesus says, you're missing this completely. You're so concerned about maintaining this image of righteousness that you're not spending time with the very people that need you. And as people of God, if we're not careful, we can be in danger of that very thing. We come here, we gather here as God's people, and we are concerned, rightly so, for having proper religious practice, for making sure that we're living holy lives, for making sure we're living righteously before God, for making sure that we're discerning correctly between light and darkness. And all of that is necessary, and all of that is right, and all of that is good. But if all of it is contained here, and worship simply becomes a means of justifying ourselves instead of extending mercy to the lost, then we are just as guilty as the Pharisees. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. During Hosea's day, the people believed that if they kept offering the right sacrifices, didn't really matter how they lived their lives privately. If they had the proper religious practice on the outside, then God would look over some of their other moral failings. And the Pharisees had that belief as well. They had tithed all these things, and God would look over those other things. And we need to be leery of that. We need to be cautious of that. That just because we come together and we worship correctly and we teach about baptism like we did this morning, that is going to make God look over our lack of spiritual fervor and mercy for people. Mercy is at the heart of the gospel. The second example is in Matthew chapter 12 that we looked at earlier. And the Pharisees are condemning the disciples in this instance, and Jesus said, if you knew what this meant, you wouldn't condemn the guiltless. What He's saying there is that they're not really violating the Sabbath. Yes, technically, by the strict interpretation of the law, they're doing physical activity. But they're missing the heart of the law. The heart of the law wasn't to cause hungry disciples going through the grain fields to starve to death. The heart that Jesus says, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Man was not meant to slavishly follow the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was meant to minister rest to man. God knew that man, out of his own sinfulness and his rebellion, he would constantly work and work and work and work, and he would never take time to rest and to reflect on the benefits of God. And so he gives Sabbath to bless humanity within the Old Covenant. So he blessed him with that. And Jesus says, you're missing the whole point. They're not violating the Sabbath. I think a good example of this is a story was told of a young mother who was with a young single mother who was with her child, and she was headed into town, and her tire blew out. And it was a kind of drizzly, rainy day, and she got out of the car, and she looked at the tire, and she thought, I don't know how to change a tire. And she looked at her baby in the back and was crying, and she didn't have her phone on her. It was before cell phones, and she thought, the only hope that I have is for some stranger to come by and to help me out. And so she sat there and waited. Finally, a car came, and it passed by her. It didn't stop. But she noticed something as they were passing. They were dressed in their Sunday best. It was a Sunday morning. And in the car, as the family is driving past, the children say to the father, Father, why don't we stop and help that woman? And he says, we've got to get to church on time. We can't forsake the assembling. Hebrews 10:25. Then they came to Bible class that morning, and the preacher asked them to open their Bibles to Matthew chapter 9. He said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. When we become so concerned about meticulous rule keeping that we overlook the need of our neighbors, we have missed the gospel. We've missed the gospel. Another instance, I think that we could say, another example of what Jesus is talking about here is someone who is sick and who is suffering and who misses worship on Sunday morning. And technically, are they missing worship? Well, yes, technically they are. They're not here. But would we say that they have violated that law? Well, no, they haven't violated that law. Why? Because we're missing the heart of what the idea of meeting together is. To stir one another up to love and to good works. And just because someone is sick and they're not able to come doesn't mean they're violating that. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. As God's people, we have to make sure that we are what John says in John 1, that we are full of grace and truth. That we're full of mercy and truth. I think another story that reminds me of this is there was a story of a church that had gathered for worship, and a man came into the auditorium late, and he obviously was not in his right mind. He had some mental issues. And he came in and he was kind of disheveled looking and dressed a little bit down, and he came right down the middle of the pew and he sat in the floor while worship is going on. He obviously, from the crowd, knew that he didn't know what he was fully doing. And everyone's kind of looking at each other. What are we going to do? One of the elders gets up from his seat, and he comes down, and he puts his hand on the man's shoulder, and he sits there with him the entire worship service. And they worship together. Now, I think the vast majority of us probably would have been so concerned with external decorum that we would have missed what was going on in that moment, which is that man needed someone to show him mercy, to give him something that he didn't necessarily deserve. And whenever religion gets in the way of us showing mercy, that's when religion has gone wrong. That is why James says in James 1 and verse 27, pure and undefiled religion before God the Father in this: to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. At the very heart of the gospel is mercy. Giving people what they don't deserve. Not giving to them what they do deserve. And it's witnessed in our marriages. It's witnessed in our relationships with other people. It's witnessed in the workplace. It's witnessed in the church and in worship. We have to be a people full of mercy, because then we will gain mercy from God. Are you a person full of mercy this evening? Do you understand the heart of the gospel? Have you received the mercy of God through obedience to the gospel? Whatever your need is, why don't you come as together we stand and as we sing.